Carmela, can you please shut the door?
Thanks for meeting me here today. I've recently moved to the UK, and this is my new office. I think it's a pretty cool... It's got a vibe to it. It's got an atmosphere, I think. I think there's a kind of... We can work with this, I think. I think this is something that we can kind of... do actually have an office, but currently it has a really bad echo. I think the glass is the main issue here. And then I went through the whole house, and I was trying to figure out the part of the house that has the least amount of echo, and it turns out it's this attic. So for the time being, we're going to be doing videos like this. So I've been rewatching The Sopranos with my mum. For the past 5 years, I've been living in Cleveland, Ohio, and I don't like to talk about this a lot, I'm actually British. I moved back to the UK, and as part of that, I built up this kind of backlog of shows that I wanted to watch with my mum.
Wow.
Something that kind of came to my mind in the process of putting together a little list of shows to watch is that I have a tendency to really enjoy dramas about very angsty, horrible men. My favourite shows at present, I would say, are probably The Sopranos, Mad Men, probably Breaking Bad, and then more recently Succession. On the one hand, they're just all, I think, very well-made shows that all kind of do their own things. But what I kind of noticed is that there's a repeating pattern of themes and ideas that kind of go through these pieces of media.
I can't have this conversation again.
That I think are maybe worth talking about for a little bit. So while I'm in the attic, I figure we might as well, you know, catch up, chat about it for a little bit. So one of the main conceits of The Sopranos is that it's about this New Jersey mob boss who's like going to therapy. And in one episode during a session, Tony Soprano, the mob boss main character, is talking about how as a kid there was this disabled boy at his school who tried to kind of befriend him and his like cool kid friend group, and they just kind of used him as this thing to passively mock, and how he never quite understood the emotional position of that kid until he, as an Italian American, tried to integrate with white people.
So am I to understand that you don't consider yourself white?
I don't mean white like Caucasian. I mean a white man. Like our friend Cusimano. He's Italian, but he's American. He eats his Sunday gravy out of a jar.
Now, a lot of people might argue that Tony Soprano is a white person. Italian Americans are, at this point, generally integrated into the whole white person collective. But when Tony is trying to kind of integrate with this sort of country club group of rich, elite dickheads, he's turned into kind of a gimmick. He becomes less of an individual person and more just a sideshow.
You got a lot of friends in New York, Tony?
Yeah. You ever go down to Little Italy?
There's definitely a few things going on here. Tony is definitely downplaying the fact that he is also, you know, a crime lord, and that maybe this may play a role in why he's being excluded in a certain kind of social sense. But at the same time, the members of the country club will freely admit that there's not really a big difference between the work that they do in legitimate enterprises and the kind of work that Tony does.
Sometimes I think the only thing separating American business from the mobs is fucking whacking somebody.
Listen to you.
And not even especially legitimate. They will openly engage in insider trading when Tony is right there.
Oh, by the way, Rand, you hear from Ross on Dexplex?
No, not yet, but the buyout is definitely going down.
Well, just give me a little warning. I need to call the islands.
Dexplex?
The criminal element doesn't seem to be the issue here. The fact is that there is this club of whiteness, and Tony is excluded from it.
Sorry, Tone. Membership's closed.
Closed.
Yeah.
I think from the outside, it's kind of strange to think that any of this would even matter to Tony. He's clearly very proud of his Italian heritage.
Some of us didn't want to swarm around their hive and lose who we were. We wanted to stay Italian and preserve the things that meant something to us. Honor, and family and loyalty.
I don't think Tony would particularly want to be reduced to white. It's not like in this context he necessarily needs the benefits of white privilege. He lives in a giant mansion with kids applying to prestigious universities. Within his own kind of realm, he is an extremely high status person. But it's clearly something that does get to Tony. The fact that there is this club that no matter what he does, he's not allowed to be a part of. Alright, so could you just... So when I was growing up in the UK, when I went to school in Brentwood, in Essex, the white population there was maybe 95%. The number might have gone down slightly, but definitely the case, like, in my school, it was just white all over the place. You wanna know how many black guys there were in my year group in school? One guy. Shout out to Dave. Hope you're doing good out there. I'm doing great. I'm doing great out here. Now, I don't like to talk about this a lot either, but I am white. And I never really thought about that much when I was a kid. And I think in large part that is for the simple reason that I grew up in such an overwhelmingly white environment that I never took it as any particular distinguishing identifier of me as an individual. It had very little meaning to me simply for the fact that I was in such a white environment that it was just kind of the thing. I would identify way more with being like left-handed. Anything else that would actually be something kind of novel in some kind of way in the particular groups of people that I was in. Now, by contrast, when I moved over to Cleveland, I was in a neighborhood that was maybe 50% white. Suddenly, my whiteness became something that was very real, something that was no longer abstract to me. While I've always been aware to some degree of racial politics, it was the first time that I felt like I was seriously engaged with myself as a member of a specific group. And when I was watching that episode of The Sopranos, it kind of made me think about that, made me think about this concept of whiteness. The club that you don't get a say as to whether you're a member of it or not, and that in many ways only exists for the purpose of this exclusion. So what about these other shows that I mentioned here, like Succession, Mad Men? These are shows that maybe make racial commentary, but I wouldn't necessarily say are shows about race. But in some ways, there is a connection there. And it's specifically in the concept of these otherwise extremely privileged men doing everything they can to be a part of this exclusive club for which they are being constantly denied. Denied not necessarily because of their race, but because there is always this thing that separates them from these other people. This thing that they struggle their entire lives to get past, regardless of any material need, regardless of any material position, a status that they seek and that they are being constantly denied. Don Draper in Mad Men is not struggling with being Italian American, but instead his struggle is with class. Now that's obviously something that Tony is also constantly struggling with. The fact is that Don Draper was born on a farm. He was an individual of extremely low status who had to spoilers, literally invent a new identity for himself just to become a part of this group. He is denied status by class and has to give up essentially everything about himself to have access to achieve any of this kind of goal. He must eliminate the things that make him strange, the things that make him different, so that he can be a part of this group that exists only to exclude those who are different. He has to become interchangeable. He has to become, in a way, purified of these distinguishing traits. And by becoming this perfect archetype of this ad executive wasp businessman... What is this? You okay, bro? And this difference obviously extends to disability, mental illness. These are all severely depressed men. And even Tony himself seems ignorant of the fact that, as a man who is diagnosed with depression, suffering from panic attacks, he himself is not so different from that disabled peer, having this distinguishing thing that he needs to hide for fear of being excluded or even very nearly killed by his own chosen tribe.
Poor me.
Honesty is such a lonely word. Yeah, I think we're good. That's good.
Kendall Roy is someone born into an immense degree of privilege, yet he still can't get past this need for status. It is more than anything the tragic flaw of his character that he cannot be contented. He cannot be happy with his position. He is constantly seeking this thing that he's never quite going to achieve. One of the major elements of Succession as a show is in Kendall's constant struggles against his father, in his desire to break a toxic cycle, end a malignance, to create a change, and to distinguish himself in doing so.
But these incidents are symptomatic of a foundational sickness within our father and his company.
Don't he use that tongue prettier than a $20 whore?
And yet he is constantly being pulled back by his desire for status.
That magnificent, awful force of him, but my God, I hope it's in me.
Tom Wamsgans, in many ways, is essentially a Don Draper character. He is also someone who comes from, while not nearly as bad a background as Don, also someone who has essentially had to downplay and sacrifice himself as an individual so that he can play a role that grants him status. These men are made utterly miserable by their constant desire to fit within the club. I think there's a connective tissue between all of these characters in that they are people who would otherwise be seen as having this immense privilege, but who are constantly chasing something, and in the process of chasing it, in many ways destroying elements of their identities that they would otherwise see as important to them. But you know what's important to me? Truth. Because the only thing keeping me from an existential crisis is knowing that there are sources out there that I can trust. And that's why this week I've been checking out Ground News. So if I'm interested in checking out news related to other HBO dramas I might be interested in checking out, I can read this article that says HBO's latest thriller shows how leftists can't just let go of the Russian collusion hoax from the Daily Caller and know that they have a right-wing bias. Who can you trust? Who can you trust? With Ground News, I stay informed not just on breaking news, but also on how trustworthy that news is, giving me a visual breakdown not just of the political bias of various news organizations, but also how much they care about the facts in the first place. You can compare headlines, you can follow specific topics. There's even a blind spot page which you can use to check on underreported stories. Knowing that Ground News is there to help me get myself on track when I'm trying to figure out what is actually happening has made me a smarter news consumer. And you can be too if you check out the links below this video and go to ground.news/JackSaint to stay informed on breaking news, compare coverage, and avoid media bias. I'd like to thank Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now let's talk more about white men. On this topic, I also can't not bring up the whole Vito subplot, which I know people have their problems with it, and I get it. It's kind of a weird inclusion for the last few episodes of the final season of The Sopranos, but it really hammers home the point. This deviance, this difference that has no material impact on the group, but still transforms him from an associate like any other into a degenerate to be thrown away at the first opportunity.
The guys that work for me are asking for head. His head. What the fuck?
This also echoed with Sal in Mad Men. I would not be the first to point out that the world of prestige television has been dominated for a long time by an overwhelming degree of white, middle-class male angst. Specifically shows about people in highly privileged positions who remain unhappy with their lot in life. And, you know, there's obvious negatives in that, representation is important, and it's great that there's like a litany of fantastic shows now that do provide that. But to a degree, when I look at a show like Succession and we look at the lack of representation you can see in that show, there is in itself a point in that. Because the fact is, this is the reality of the business world. This is the reality of people like Kendall Roy. They exist within these bubbles. They exist within these spaces where their seemingly insignificant problems are everything to them. Where their personal hang-ups and insecurities are everything. And then they project that back onto the world. The same can be said for The Sopranos, for Mad Men, shows that give us a glimpse into these other worlds, but for the most part are very contained within the psyches of their main characters, giving us a glimpse into the existential horror of straight white men. These are shows, more than anything else, about men trying to keep up appearances within declining empires.
It's over for the little guy.
That they themselves, in many ways, despise.
You're fucking bullshit, man. I'm fucking bullshit. She's bullshit. It's all fucking nothing. Man, I'm telling you this because I know it, okay? We're nothing.
Mob bosses, executives, CEOs, men in positions that would otherwise be seen as highly aspirational, and they're miserable. Constantly miserable, with their apparent material success giving them almost no comfort for the existential dread that they're dealing with. The constant striving to maintain status in such a way that actually destroys the individual. To be put into this high status world and to be kept within this bubble that makes it basically impossible to truly connect with, to empathize with the real struggles of other groups.
I love you, but you are not serious people.
Groups that materially have far more to lose. Even within that episode of The Sopranos that I was talking about, there's this whole subplot with Chris and this music producer, and how he's fighting on behalf of this black musician who was taken advantage of, now trying to seek some degree of reparations for a situation they were significantly disadvantaged in. A million miles away from the problems that characters like Tony are facing. Like I say, prestige television, whatever that means, it's very good that that is becoming less of this very self-contained kind of group. Shows made for a very specific type of angst-ridden audience. But I think there's more than just negatives that we can take from this era, because these are shows that in large part are about the tragedy of these conditions. There's a lot of reasons that Tony and Kendall are not great people, but I think more than anything, it is this short-sightedness that is their tragic downfall. To be warped into the plight of not being allowed the highest position in a group that you may not even necessarily want to be a part of. Only you can't really even think about if you want to be part of it, because it's all you've ever really known. Something that only has meaning in exclusion. What the fuck is going on out there? And if people want to say that this is actually just me coping about having the most stereotypical tastes in the universe, well, I also love Atlanta. So there's something to these shows as being in many ways shows about people realizing that they are within these bubbles, that they are trapped in these worlds where they are constantly trying to attain something. They're constantly trying to be at the top of these artificial pyramids, either realizing or failing to realize that it is this constant striving, it is this constant desire to attain a status within this bubble that is destroying them, that these are one and the same, that they're never going to have that snapshot moment where they're at the top and happy, because in trying to be at the top, this is what has made them unhappy. This perpetual angst of wanting to be part of this exclusive category for the purpose of this status, when in doing so you end up destroying the very things that distinguish you in ways that make you individual. This completely inverted idea of community. What I'm saying is, It's evil to be white. In the process of editing this video, I actually really struggled to have a kind of conclusive remark on this topic. What do I have to say about this whole existential horror thing? And look, I have my issues with Zizek that are probably worth talking about in another video, but I found this quote by him that I'm just going to read because I think it really feeds into my point. Typical male chauvinist scenario. I'm married with a wife. Relations with her are cold and I have a mistress. And every night I dream, oh my god, if only my wife were to somehow disappear, this would start up a new wonderful life with the mistress. You know what every psychoanalyst will tell you often happens? If something happens to your wife, she dies or whatever, you lose the mistress also. You thought this is all I want, but once you obtain it, you realise that what you really wanted was not really to live with the mistress, but to keep her as an unattainable object of desire that you almost have, but never quite fully obtain. All of these men that I've been talking about are seeking something. They're searching for validation. They're searching for something to tell them that even though they are in these positions of high status, they deserve them. They have what they want and they can be contented. But they are not contented. They instead have identities that they are vicariously living through. Invented archetypes, categories, groups that they are trying to fit within at the expense of their own individual selves. And that's the horror. That's the horror. A completely self-defeating idea of self. And that's what I think these shows talk about. That's what I think these shows are getting into. And while there's obvious issues with this level of focus into these types of characters, that's what I think it's about. I mean, they're about a lot of things, but that's one of the things I think they're about. There's a lot to talk about with these shows, and I definitely want to over the next few weeks and months. But that was just one small element that I thought was interesting, a thing that I kind of was thinking about as a result of rewatching these shows. I'm getting very sweaty in this attic now, so I'm going to stop speaking. But I hope maybe me in this attic has given you some food for thought. Food for thought. Incidentally, moving between continents has also been extremely expensive. So if you like the channel, if you like the videos, as I get back into the swing of things, you can use the support links down below. You can be one of these patrons that's scrolling by now. I've got a little donation tip links. I'm also probably going to have to turn off monetization for a little bit while I sort of switch over. I think it's going to be cool. I think we're going to do some cool British content. I'm very excited for my British arc.
Fuck the patriarchy!